Hello, welcome to part one of visual narratives. Architecture starts and ends as graphic design. And I mean this statement quite literally. As students of architecture or practitioners of architecture, you always communicate your ideas through the tools of graphic design. So it seems quite important to be intentional and understand those tools so that you can use them to your advantage. I mean, representing architecture through a kind of two-dimensional medium has been a phenomenon that's, has been around for centuries. So the way that architectural images get disseminated and ideas get expressed and the way that presentations get made, these are all done through the tools of graphic design. So what we're trying to do with the series of lectures and workshops is allow you to, or help you to understand these tools and sort of use them to your advantage with intentionality. So part one, I want to focus on images and diagrams. So images meaning a kind of an array of photographic images and how one can manipulate them. And then the second part of part one being more about diagrams. And I mean that in a kind of larger sense of the word. So thinking through images, you can see this image as a pretty sort of normal or banal photograph of apples. There's nothing remarkable about it. There's no styling. It just seems like maybe, somebody used an iPhone to take this photo. There's no specialized lighting to speak of. It's just a very kind of a regular photo of apples. But what about this picture of apples? You start to actually notice the styling in comparison to the image that we just saw. So the apples are composed in such a way, the background has been sort of laid out in such a way. There's a piece of cloth, it might indicate that maybe there was a food stylist involved. What about this picture of apples? It seems as though these apples are hanging from a tree, hanging off a branch. The background color is this kind of sky blue color that looks slightly synthetic, maybe, but clearly the photography is trying to indicate a kind of organic sort of outdoor context. So this is actually a piece by Christopher Williams, who's a contemporary photographer, conceptual artist. This photo of apples, it begins to actually become something else. It's a kind of beauty shot. You can see the kind of condensation carefully placed on the surface of the apple. The lighting is very dramatic. The colors are very, very vivid. So, a photo like this was taken with a completely different set of intentions. And then compare that with this image of various different apples. It's not about the singular apple anymore. It becomes about a variety of different apple types, and perhaps maybe in the context of a supermarket or a greengrocer's. And then this image, which is a photograph of a vitrine that contains many different apples, it seems, and it's titled Bad Apples. Now it's really not so much about the form of the apple, or apple as food, or apple as something that grows on trees. It's really about this kind of visual pun. So each apple is kind of rotting or decaying in some way, and that becomes the message, that visual pun. So with images beyond selection, there are many sort of tools that you can use, very, very simple tools that you can use to your advantage. So the most simple, basic tool being cropping. So if you look at this image on the left of David, this very famous sculpture of David, you see the entirety of the sculpture. If you look at the cropping on the right, the frame has sort of zoomed into his face, sort of highlighting his features and maybe some of his neck. So then, when you compare the left image with the right image, you might actually start thinking about different aspects of the sculpture. So you might think about the kind of the perfect proportion of the male figure of David when you look at the image on the left. But for the image on the right, you might start to look at his eyes, his expression, his kind of determination right before he goes and goes into battle with Goliath. for instance. So these two sculptures, even though, two images of the same sculpture, even though the source material is the same, depending on what you focus on, the story might change. So what about if you zoom into different parts of the body, the lower half of David, or just the left torso, or the hand that seems to be cradling this rock that he's just about to throw, or the knee. So when you crop, you're not only are you focusing the eye of the viewer onto a very specific area of the photograph, what you're also doing is you're leaving out the rest. And sometimes by leaving out something, you start to imply a story that's not being told directly in that frame. This is actually a very famous example of cropping. This is Elvis with the $1 Million Quartet, and there, it seems like on the image on the left, the four men, they're kind of happily singing, maybe, creating a song or something, practicing in the studio. But what a lot of people don't know is that it was cropped. This image was cropped from a kind of wider photograph. So if you look at the image on the right, you see a woman who's kind of perched on the piano. She was apparently Elvis's girlfriend at the time, but this is unknown to most people because her image was cropped out of the picture. So these two images tell a slightly different kind of story. And when the people that disseminated this photograph, when they decided to take her out of the picture, I mean, we can sort of guess as to what their intentionality behind that was. Maybe they found her presence to be distracting. Maybe it wasn't sort of an essential part of the story of the quartet. You can also think about zooming in and out. And zooming in and out can mean, cropping into a photograph, but it could also mean taking the photograph from a particular perspective. So the very famous Thermal by Peter Zumthor, you can appreciate the kind of stark contrast between the brutalist rectilinear architecture against the kind of beautiful pastoral, kind of Swiss Alps landscape. And then if you look at the images on the right, these images become almost kind of like abstract paintings, if you will. The photographer focuses on a very specific sort of area of the building, like the joints, the kind of very perfectly detailed, wall and ceiling. So now you're focusing on a slightly different aspect of the building. So it's not about this kind of monumental scale or this kind of, ambition. It's much more about this kind of attention to detail or the kind of flawless geometry. Pairing is a really useful tool, and it's used all the time. These two images, there's some kind of direct correlations of the two images, and then there is these kind of more layered readings that you could make. So if you look at the two images, there are some similarities, some kind of direct formal similarities. One of those is that they're black and white photographs of buildings, and they're taken from directly in front of the building, as opposed to above the building or kind of 45-degree angle. So there's a kind of perspectival symmetry or perspectival similarity between these two images. And then once you start to kind of read into what these structures indicate, one being the Parthenon and the other being Villa Savoye by Le Corbusier, both very, very important buildings, as you know. The Parthenon, a building which has existed for a much, much longer time, is a kind of example of, or a pursuit of this kind of perfect geometry, this kind of beautiful proportion. And Villa Savoye, I would argue, is doing the same thing, but at a different point in time. So you can start to make these connections between these two buildings that may or may not have existed before. The verticality of the columns, the importance of these vertical columns, that are very sort of strong visual aspects of these two buildings. So when you pair two things together, you make immediate connections based on the formal qualities of the photograph. But then after a while, you start to digest the meaning of the subject, meaning of what you're seeing, and then you start to make connections that are a little bit more uh, in depth. You may have seen these um, images before. These are advertising for architecture by Bernard Tschumi. So I've chosen two examples here. There's many more, but they both use this kind of strategy or the tactic of pairing two photographs that have similarities and differences. So the first pair shows the same building and the same sort of space, one being empty and the other one filled with a crowd, and it questions the kind of idea of the condition, designing that architecture is not about the conditions of design, but the design of conditions. And then the images on the right, the left image is a kind of a spiral parking structure, and then the image on the right, far right, is the Guggenheim Museum, as you know. And so this particular advertising, quote unquote, it talks about how architecture is not about what it looks like, but it's also about how it functions. And it kind of reminds us of the slide we just looked at, comparing Parthenon and Villa Savoye. So you immediately make these connections, visual connections, and understand the similarities between these two structures. But when you actually start to think about how these buildings perform, you understand that actually they perform very differently. I sometimes look at this Instagram account, which is just architectural memes. They're very kind of in some ways lighthearted, but in some ways actually very I don't know, sort of insightful. This one I thought was kind of an example of a funny pairing. So the image on the left is an actual existing building, detail of an existing building. And this studio is called Setup Architecture. And so it's just a regular sort of commercial building, I believe, and it has this kind of interesting window detail that is lit a certain way, which seems to resemble the Microsoft Windows logo, Windows 95 logo. I'm sure they have nothing to do with each other, but as soon as you put these two things, two completely unrelated things next to each other, we do start to make those connections. So it's a kind of visual pun. Grouping is another very useful strategy that one might use. So the image on the left, you may have seen either this piece or some other piece by the Beckers. Beckers were German photographers, and they were very famous for taking photographs of infrastructural structures. So, for example, this one is a collection of water towers, but they, took photos of bridges or, grain silos or walls or, water towers or these sorts of structures that you might see um, in our landscape. So this one is, there's 9 different water towers, but they're arranged in a 3x3 grid, which was actually a very typical way for them to present their images. And what that does to present 9 things that are similar in a grid like this, and also shot from a very kind of straightforward angle, no people around. They always shot when it was kind of overcast out as to avoid dramatic shadowing and lighting. So there's a very kind of stoic look at these structures that are just kind of there. And, the kind of ubiquitous actually. And you start to make sort of connections, visual connections, you start to kind of look at them a little bit differently because they're presented as a collection. This piece on the right is a piece by an artist called Francis Alice, and the set is called Fabiola, or this piece is called Fabiola, and the piece is essentially a collection of paintings, a collection of very similar paintings, which are all replicas of an existing painting from the 18th century of Fabiola, who's a saint. And the artist just went around Europe collecting these paintings that were made by amateur artists and at flea markets or antique shops and places like this. And just by collecting these similar images and presenting them a certain way, I think it sort of reveals something about how a person or a saint of a certain time is revered by a culture. So it's a really interesting kind of way of practicing art, is collecting as art making. So as opposed to the Beckers who actually went out and took their photographs and then arranged them in a grid. Frances Elise, what she's doing is collecting existing images, and the collection itself becomes the artwork. These are also examples of groupings, but quite different from the slide we just saw. So the image on the left is by artist Roy Arden, and I say image on the left is by him, but actually the image is not by him. The images are found images, the aerial shots that he essentially collected and is arranging in this way. So again, collection and arranging becomes the kind of the creative endeavor. And these are all aerial shots taken from varying distances. So you start to look at I mean, the first thing you notice is that it's a kind of loose grid that's filled with black and white images of seemingly kind of landscape or urban areas, non-urban areas. But then when you start to really look at the individual images, you start to notice the differences, the difference in perspective, the difference in distance, the difference in location, etc. The image on the right is a collection of objects, actual objects that were collected or that were chosen rather by Wes Anderson and Juma Malouf for a show that they put together at the Fondazione Prada. So they went to the archives of the Art History Museum and the Natural History Museum in Vienna, and in this case, selection being a kind of creative act. So they selected these pieces from the two museums and then made a show of those selected pieces. And this particular poster shows those selected pieces kind of all collected at various scales, but kind of packing this, the rectangular area so that things sort of slot together. So there's no grid to speak of, but there's a kind of organic system by which these things are put together and arranged. So moving on from grouping, another way of thinking about images or collection of images is what you can do to sort of change the meaning or to imply something else. So in this case, numbering becomes a kind of tactic. So on the left, you see an image of an exhibition wall actually that we designed at Common Name for the Carnegie Museum of Art a few years ago. The show is called 2020, and the numbers I want you to focus on are actually not the big numbers, but the small numbers next to the individual images. So you can see these images as sort of parts of fragments of artworks that were presented in the show. So some of them are paintings, some of them are photographs, and each one has a little sort of footnote or figure number next to it. And in this image, it doesn't actually show what that means, like what the numbers refer to. But as soon as you see these numbers, you, I think, intuitively understand through, our exposure to systems like figures and foot numbers, we understand that there is another part of the story, or there's something to be looked into or to be read into. So another part of this show were these keywords and names of the artists that were paired with these numbers. So similarly, the image on the right, which is the cover for a book that a studio Lynn did for ODA. ODA is an architecture studio based in New York. And they do a lot of sort of commercial buildings, quite sort of slick, glossy condos and like fancy commercial buildings in New York. And this is a book that they produced a couple of years ago. And by mixing these different kinds of images, so it seems like some of them might be, photos of their building, or a historical archival image, or a map, or maybe a photograph of the office. We don't know exactly, but what we understand from this image is that there's different types of images, and those different types of images indicate something and they're key to something, either a concept or a project or something else entirely. But it is implied, that idea that there's something more to be learned is implied by these numbers that sort of exist next to the images. So this slide is about alignment. Alignment to mean how you arrange images and how they align. So in this case, it's a fairly straightforward alignment, as you can see on the image on the left. So the left image and the right image are just front and back of the same poster, and the poster is essentially a visual index of all the books that were produced on a certain year by Artimo, which was a publishing house which is now defunct. So Artimo A to Z basically shows like the A to Z of everything that they've published in a particular year. So on the left side, you just see the kind of the silhouette of those books. On the right side, you see the actual covers of those books with a little informational blurb at the bottom. So here, everything sits in a grid, but because the books are presumably of different proportion and different sizes, they don't fit the grid entirely, but they align at the top and they align at the center. So, you can kind of understand that these are very similar things. Even when they do vary in scale, they don't vary in scale wildly. So it's a kind of conventional way of organizing something, objects that are quite similar to each other. And then if you compare that with these examples of alignments, the left image being a spread out of a magazine, the right image being an image, an installation image of Wolfgang Tillmann's show, one of his older shows. I think it's interesting to think about what happens when you arrange images so that they're roughly the same size and there's a kind of legible sort of grid that happens, versus examples like these where you don't really see a kind of logic, an overt logic. It's a kind of looser arrangement. It feels much more sort of intuitive rather than rational. And so you start to kind of read into those adjacencies and alignments. So if you look at the image on the left, you can see that it's a spread of a book, because you can see the gutter indicated by the shadow. But it looks like these kind of long, we don't know exactly what they are, but these kind of long sort of organism or creatures, they seem to sort of be like connecting to each other. Whereas the Wolfgang Tillmann's image on the right, they are photographs that are all printed all at different scale, seemingly kind of scattered and hung on the wall. And this is a very strange, in some ways, or definitely a very unconventional way of experiencing a photography show. When we think about a photography show, a very sort of standard photography show, we expect the images to be framed and treated kind of like precious objects oftentimes. So they will be framed, they'll be hung on the wall, so that they're completely sort of perpendicular and parallel to the ground. The style of the frame probably indicates something, and then the distance between image to image is probably, very intentionally defined. And oftentimes, those images might be the same size or similar in scale, but the way that Wolfgang Tillmann arranges his images on this wall, it feels very loose. It feels quite casual, not only in the disparate sizes and the arrangement, but also in the fact that none of these images are framed. Collaging is a tool that I'm sure that you have used, or at least very familiar with. So collaging can be a very useful tool because it's a way of collapsing different worlds. It's a quite a sort of effective way of doing that. And unlike other ways of collapsing different worlds, like in renderings or kind of computer sort of these methods that are aided by a computer software, collaging is a method that can actually allow you to be quite rough or a little bit crude, but that can also be a part of the style. It could actually be sort of something that's advantageous. So if you look at the image on the left, you see, one of these very famous collages by Super Studio, and it's literally collapsing kind of organic natural world, this kind of mountainscape with this very strange, almost alien geometric structure that kind of just sits on top of it. So, the style of one world is photographics, the style of another world, this white structure, this kind of grid structure, is not. So you have two different, very different geometries. You also have very different photographic or kind of visual styles. And those two things collide, and that creates a certain kind of sensibility that's actually very recognizable to us right at this point. If you look at the image on the right, this was a collage that was produced by, I believe, OMA or AMO for Knoll, for one of their kind of anniversaries. And you see a picture of black and white photograph of Florence Knoll holding her dog. Her figure is kind of outlined. And she seems to be kind of sitting on this chair, and in this space that's been sort of created from different pieces, different visual elements. But then within this three-dimensional space, which in parts is quite convincing as a real space, you have these other elements that have collapsed into the space in a kind of nonsensical way. So, at the center of the image, you see the side of this human head with mushroom cloud kind of emerging inside of it. So that cutout, this photograph has been cut out into the shape of a human head, profile of a human head, and that's just kind of sitting disembodied in the middle of this room. Behind Florence Knoll, you see this orange hand, this kind of palm print. There's also very flat and very mannered, actually, in the way that it's cut out. So you see these things that obviously don't belong in the same world, but by collapsing them together, two-dimensional things, three-dimensional things, photographs, illustrations, graphics, you create a kind of a different world. And in that way, it can be a very useful tool to sort of communicate an idea. And this last image in the image section is it's about redaction, and redaction is a kind of useful tool. So if collage is a method of adding, so you have an image, you add another kind of image, a different kind of image, and you create a new world by this kind of additive process. Redaction is, I would say, maybe the opposite. So these images, you may be familiar with the artist John Baldessari. He has a lot of different types of works, a very prolific artist, but he was really also well known for this one series of paintings where he would put dots on people's heads, so kind of anonymizing them through a kind of redaction of their faces. On the left, these are not just heads, these are kind of figures that have been cut out of the photographs or cut out of the paintings or sort of painted over. But sometimes by redacting something, you call more attention to it. So in that way, you can manipulate it as a useful tool to sort of draw attention to something. So this image shows Barbara Kruger's work. And Barbara Kruger, is a visual artist, and she still makes artwork today. But these, at least the first two images were from the 80s. Her work has a very distinctive style. And especially from this era, she used very graphic black and white imagery that were often juxtaposed with this graphic layer. So in this case, you see the type. One poster says "Your body is a battleground," another one says "I shot, therefore I am." These messages that are typed in a certain typeface. In this case, it's Futura Bold Italic, locked up inside a red rectangle that's sort of pasted on top of a very graphic, grainy, often grainy black and white imagery. This kind of image becomes almost like her trademark. So, Barbara Kruger sort of created this look, if you will. So if you look up a lot of her work, there's a kind of similarity in their punchiness, in the way that the way that she sort of uses language and imagery and the juxtaposition of those two things to create, to critique contemporary culture. So this, one in the middle is a clear critique of our consumerist culture. And then that language actually gets pulled and used to say some other things as well. So this image on the far right is a cover for New York Magazine from 2016. So this was right before the 2016 election, before we knew actually what was going to happen. Where a lot of people were quite sure that Trump was going to lose, and so before the election, what the results were known, this cover was actually released with a grainy, sort of graphic, very zoomed in, very unattractive photograph of Trump with the sticker sort of on his nose that says "loser." So from here on, we'll look at diagrams, and I put an asterisk here just as a disclaimer to say that I mean diagrams in a kind of expansive way. So we're not just talking about architectural diagrams; we're talking about diagrams as a way to visualize information. Diagrams, I would say, when you make a diagram, as with any kind of design sort of activity, it's a set of decisions, right? You're making decisions, and those decisions are about what you're going to include and what you're not going to include. So here you see a map of Manhattan, or at least the kind of slightly lower part of Manhattan and the surrounding boroughs, and a part of New Jersey. But the way that it's expressed is very kind of it's skeletal. So you only see black lines indicating the contours of the island and the neighboring boroughs, and indicating the streets and bridges that connect the blocks and the different areas of the city. So what it doesn't include, it doesn't include color, it doesn't include architecture, it doesn't include it doesn't indicate parks or public spaces beyond the way that the kind of the paths or routes indicated in the Central Park area. So it's a map that has decided to include certain things and other things, and all diagramming is this kind of act of deciding what to include. And so when you make those decisions, it seems very important to be very intentional about what you're including and what you're not including. This first diagram I think is a really beautiful example of a diagram, and it's a very simple diagram in a way, because the thing that is being represented and the thing that is representing it are the same, meaning black in this case means black, brown in this case means brown. So this diagram is a diagram that shows the evolution of colors at Crayola, for Crayola crayons. So if you look at the x-axis at the top, you will see a range of numbers going from 1903 to 2010. So it shows all the colors that have existed at Crayola at that time. So in 1903, at the very beginning, you see 8 colors, and those colors are indicated as those actual colors. So then as you move across the x-axis, you go to 1935, 1949, the colors start to split, and then more colors start to get added. The kind of overall effect of the diagram is that it gets more and more complex as you move across the x-axis. So to the right, you see the colors that are fragmented into dozens of colors. And I'm sure if this included a time frame up until now, 2020, I'm sure it would be even more fragmented. So I think it's a really nice diagram. It's a very understandable one because there's really no translation that needs to happen. You don't have to learn what blue means or what yellow means because it indicates the thing itself. This is a diagram that shows a chart, a kind of an identification chart that shows all the tablets that were produced by this pharmaceutical company. This chart, I believe, was made in the 60s. And if you actually look at pharmaceutical graphics, especially coming out of Switzerland in the 60s and 70s, they're very, very beautiful. I think this is a really beautiful example of something like that. We don't expect a kind of pharmaceutical visualization chart to be beautiful in this way, but it's really it's sort of organized very, very graphically and boldly with these thick black lines. And then the pills, again, kind of like the Crayola chart that we just looked at, the tablets indicate tablets, so they represent themselves. Because it's an identification chart and it's imperative that you consume the right tablet, there's no translation that can happen. Like, the pink pill needs to be represented by a pink pill, so there's no mistake in understanding what that thing is. This is a diagram that shows or compares this different vegetation. So there's 6 to 7 different plants here. Each one is labeled by a letter. And what's nice about this diagram is that it shows what's seen and what can't be seen. So seen meaning everything that sort of emerges out of the earth, out of the soil, that we can see with our naked eye. Like, if we can see these plants and what they look like. But the part that we can't see with the naked eye, the roots, how far the roots go down into the soil, how they spread out, how they branch, like what kind of form they take. These are things that we can't be seen. So it combines both aspects, what goes above ground and what grows below ground. So, I mean, it's a very kind of literal sort of representation, again, because there's no, the shape is the shape, and the size, you see the relative scale of the 7 different plants and how they kind of measure up next to each other. You can see that by the y-axis. That seems to be the measurement. And then, where the soil, where the soil and the air meet, that's the 0 point. So above that, positive numbers, and below that are negative numbers. You'll be very familiar with the periodic table from your chemistry classes in high school, middle school. But the periodic table is, I think, a really succinct example of how important adjacencies are. So with the periodic table, adjacencies are really everything. Like, each element has its particular position in the periodic table, and that position cannot be changed. They are where they are because of the properties of the atomic numbers and their qualities, and whether they're metals or gases. These things indicate where they are. So there's definitely different sort of visual versions of the periodic table where the colors might be a little bit different, or the spacing might be a little bit different, but the basic format of the periodic table cannot be changed. It is, it looks like this because it's fundamentally a description of how the atoms and electrons are arranged. So it's, I think the positioning is really everything in this case. These diagrams you might see if you've ever looked at a graphic design sort of textbook or a graphic design history book. These 2 diagrams do the same thing. They both talk about this typeface, very, very important modernist typeface called Universe. And the Universe was a typeface that was designed in Switzerland, and it was designed with a particular kind of ethos, which was that it was going to be this kind of universal typeface, a typeface that can be used anywhere, the kind of most platonic, modern, sort of a neutral typeface. That was the idea behind the creation of this typeface. So when the designer designed this typeface, it was important that it came with a big family. So if you look at the blue section in this left diagram, you'll see in the second row 55. So where it says 55, that's the regular weight, the kind of standard, the default. And then as you go above it, they get lighter and lighter, and if you go below it, they get heavier and heavier. If you go to the left, they get wider, which in typographic terms is called extended. If you go to the right, they become thinner, skinnier, and in typographic terms, that's called condensed. So this diagram includes all the entire family of this typeface, Roman to italic, extended to condensed, light, extra light to bold, heavy, and black. And the position that they occupy in this kind of grid indicates where they are in this spectrum of proportion and weight. So the diagram on the right does a similar thing, but in some ways it's even more succinct because it's just doing it. The diagram is kind of expressing itself with one letter, which is the lowercase u. So I think it's really clever and kind of beautiful the way that the oblique lowercase u sort of is stacked together, but not one above each other, but in this kind of slightly diagonal way to indicate the level, the degree in which the oblique is leaning right slightly. So this is a diagram that shows time that it takes, or it took, to travel between America and Europe. So the first row, the first image shows 1492, and it shows that Columbus took 70 days to go from the European shores to America. And you can see how the two poles, or the two continents, are indicated by this kind of gray mass, and they seem like vaguely architectural. And then in the middle, the connecting part is the sea, the body of water, the ocean, which is indicated in red. And then in the middle of that is this kind of red thing, that's the transportation method. And that icon changes, and you can see the progression of the transportation method as time passes. And then another thing that happens is that the blue area, the ocean, gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And we know that the ocean did not get smaller. The world did not get smaller. What happened was transportation methods developed, technology developed, which means that it took less time to go from one place to the other. So in this diagram, instead of indicating distance as distance, the distance now means time. So in this case, if it takes longer, even though the distance doesn't change, the blue area, the blue line, gets longer. And at the end of the diagram, of course, now it takes even less to get from Europe to America, but here it says 2 days. And so now that the ocean gets much shorter, bringing the European continent and the American continent much closer together. So in diagramming, a lot of these kinds of things happen where translation happens. So, it could mean, like I had mentioned when we were looking at the Crayola example, where like red means something, red means X, blue means Y. But it could also mean that sometimes area means distance, or area means time. So it's really up to the designer to figure out like the most sort of effective way of translating a certain kind of information, and then also allowing that to be known to the viewer, so that the viewer can quickly decipher that translation. This is another diagram that does a similar thing, but in a slightly different visual way. So the central point of this diagram is London, which is indicated by the star. This diagram is called the unevenness of time-space convergence. So what it indicates is, and it was done in 1981. So of course, if this diagram was done in 2010, it would look very different. But what it shows is how long it takes to get to these different places, different cities from London. So to get from London to Birmingham, it takes less than 2 hours. And you can see that because of these concentric circles that have hours indicated. So from the star, you have 2 hours, the first circle, the next circle is 4 hours, next one, 6, 8, 10, etc. So as you get closer to the inner circle, it means it takes less time to get there. It doesn't mean that it's actually closer to London physically, it just means that it takes less time. So depending on the type of transportation that's available between London and that particular city, it would it could get pulled into the center of this diagram or pulled out, which is why, from London, it says that it takes a similar amount of time to get to, Madrid as Penzance. Penzance is actually, physically might be closer than Milan or Dusseldorf, but it actually takes longer because of the lack of transportation method. And similarly, this kind of diagram brings Montreal or New York much closer to London, in a way that is completely, not realistic geographically, because there are these, the direct flights presumably to Montreal, London, that shortens that trip, therefore closing in the distance. This is a diagram that shows the amount of rainfall at various parts of the UK. So what you don't see here are the kind of the contours of the British Isles. So this diagram that we saw before, it shows the contours of the British Isles, but a heavily distorted contour. This diagram actually doesn't show the contours at all, but you can kind of make out the contours of the British Isles, even though it's not there, because the rainfalls that are indicated by these vertical black bars, they sit on the map in a particular way, and there's enough of them, and there's enough rainfall that the map becomes actually legible, even though it doesn't exist or it wasn't expressed. So I think this diagram is a good example of a kind of minimal rendering of something. So, with that first slide, when we started talking about diagrams, I had mentioned that diagramming is a kind of a series of making decisions about what to show and what not to show. So in this case, the designer has chosen not to show what the country looks like. It has chosen, he or she has chosen to only show rainfall and the amount of rainfall in the length, the height of the black bars. And that's enough. That indicates sort of where these rainfalls are happening. And if you really want to drill down and sort of read about the details, there's a kind of index or legend at the bottom, which presumably have numbers that are key to each of these bars. So in a kind of converse way, completely opposite way, this illustration, I would call, or this kind of visualization of the Earth, and we call this blue marble. I think this iteration of the Earth's image is often referred to as a blue marble because it kind of looks like a blue marble. Is really well known. I think it was used as a startup image for one of the previous generations of iPhones. So this is an image that's very, very familiar to us. It was generated by a visual artist, Robert Simon, at NASA. I think it happened around 2001, 2002. And what's really interesting about this version of the Earth's image is that it's a composite. It's not, at the time, it wasn't actually possible, technologically possible, to produce an image like this or photograph an image like this. And even if it was possible, it wouldn't actually look this perfect, which is kind of a weird thing to think about. So the actual image of Earth is too unfamiliar, too unlike the image of Earth that we have in our minds, so that it had to be composited and had to be manipulated in this way. So actually, this blue marble image is actually an amalgam of basically 6 different layers. Each one has its own kind of particular function. So it's a very synthetic image. And if you read about it, you'll learn that the cloud coverage, actually, that this layer alone was photographed for over 3 or 4 months period of time, so that the coverage was just enough. They could composite just the right amount of cloud coverage for it to look realistic, look convincing, but also not cover any of the continents too much, so that it would obscure the any part of the world. So I thought that was kind of interesting to think about, that that we, the visual artists at NASA had to go into this kind of painstaking detail to actually perfect the image of Earth so that it would actually look natural to us. These sorts of diagrams, I'm sure you're very familiar with. This is a program diagram by OMA, and this is for the Seattle Museum, Seattle Public Library. And so, the first one, the original program, it shows us just the breakdown of the myriad different uses for the museum, and then the second one shows blue versus white, blue indicating books, and then program consolidation, meaning it's just grouping sort of kind of like defragmentation diagrams for hard drives or something like that. It groups the same things together so you can kind of compare how much real estate books take up, how much real estate support takes up, research takes up, this sort of thing. So it's a kind of useful way to compare real estate to of each section. And in this case, in the diagram, the real estate of the diagram is a real estate of the actual building. So you could also think about the ink coverage equals real estate. So if you have this much blue ink, that means you have this many books that cover the real estate at the library. And then the last version on the far right shows how that program has been reshuffled. And some of it's doing this kind of Jenga thing where some of the levels are kind of slot out, and that starts to indicate how the Seattle Library actually is designed, actually functions. This is also a program diagram by OMA, but this is actually much older. This is from 1991, I believe. This was for the Yokohama Master Plan. And there's something really actually quite different about this diagram compared to the one we just saw. The kind of aesthetic qualities of this diagram is that there is none. It's not an aesthetic object. It's about communicating this very simple and very understood idea of program consolidation, how much room something takes, and how we compare those different sections. And so it's kind of anti-aesthetic, like the typography that it's using, the colors, the way in which that it's just this kind of blunt bar graph format. It's really just like focusing you on the colors, therefore the program and how those things compare. Whereas if you look at this diagram, even though it's doing almost the same thing, it is quite an aesthetic object, and it has a very distinct sort of style. I think the most noteworthy thing is this axis at the top, the numbers that go from 0 to 24. So that shows time scale. So the numbers indicate 24 hours in a day. And when you look along that scale, what you understand is it's not a program diagram that is about a fixed time frame. It's a kind of a looser program diagram, which makes sense because it's talking about a master plan and how a city gets used over time throughout the course of a day. So obviously, at mealtime, so at lunchtime, the eating part peaks. At dinner time, it's kind of a slow build up and then a slow fade. Entertainment, a lot of the entertainment happens at nighttime, doesn't really happen in the morning. The market happens, it's busier during the early hours of the morning. So these things kind of undulate, they grow and then they recede in the way that the Seattle library program diagram didn't. So there's that aspect of time, which is really interesting to think about. But then the idea of style, the Seattle example uses color. This one doesn't use color, it's exclusively black and white, but it uses these kind of fill patterns instead. And while I'm not sure that this is the case, to me, it sort of reminds me of a kind of Japanese manga technique where mangas are printed only using one ink, because for sort of printing economy reasons. And instead of using color, the artist might use these kind of shading techniques, these kind of fill patterns to indicate different textures or different shades or colors. So that to me, it seems that this diagram is using like a similar techniques, whereas the market is kind of this kind of dotted pattern. The eating part is like a smaller, more granular dotted pattern, and the shops are filled. The library is this kind of wavy pattern. So another thing that allows for the reader do is to see through the different sort of program areas. So through the stadium, you can see the cinema. Through the education, you can see sports, and so on. This diagram is quite well known, and it was, I think, devised by Alfred Barr for an exhibition that happened at MoMA. The exhibition was about cubism and abstract art, and this diagram, in a way, is a sort of attempt to codify and sort of indicate relationships between different art movements, at least in the kind of the Western canon, mostly. So you can see these connections, these kind of implied connections between neo-impressionism to cubism that goes to, constructivism that influences Bauhaus, these sorts of things. So you also see this timescale on the side that goes from 1890 to 1935. So this is it's a progression, right? It's happening over time. So it goes from oldest to newest movement, and at this point it ends up in 1935 at geometric abstract art, which what the show is about. And what I think is really interesting about this diagram is that it takes the format of something that implies a kind of hyper-rational connections or hyper-rational sort of relationships. So like a flow chart, like a computer flow chart or something like that. But it's actually making connections between things that are actually much more loose, and it's seen through the lens of a particular person, a particular art historian, a particular institution, at a particular city, at a particular point in time. So none of these things are objective truths, but by presenting this information in this way as a kind of flow chart like diagram, it starts to imply a kind of a stance that is maybe more logical, or is like based on some kind of truth. These diagrams do similar things in slightly different ways. The one on the left was designed by Graphic Thought Facility, which is a design studio in London. And this diagram, if you look closely, each of the kind of nodes that you can't read at the scale are projects that this studio has done over time, and they've been around for a while, and they've done many projects. So each project is sort of indicated as a piece of text, and the thick black lines create connection points between projects and different clients. So when they were invited to do the show in Tokyo, they made this poster, and I think it's a way of indicating how all of their projects, or many of their projects at least, have some kind of connection to each other, and how one thing leads to another and leads to another, and that becomes almost like a portrait of a studio. And I can sort of relate to that. We run our studio, and we've been doing it for about a decade, and so many of our projects are through referrals and connections, and it's very rare that things completely exist in sort of isolation or come out of a vacuum. So this is a very understandable kind of impulse to like diagram your projects and the kind of relation points that I could definitely relate to this impulse. The image on the right is Mark Lombardi piece. He's an artist whose artwork often takes form in these kind of diagrams, these hand-drawn, sort of delicate diagrams. So, just stylistically, it's a huge contrast with the GTF diagram on the left, but they do similar things, which is essentially about making connections. So Lombardi, if the GTF example is very much about their kind of personal experiences, personal as a studio, but nevertheless, it's about their relationship with their clients and certain projects that they have experienced. Mark Lombardi's connection diagrams are about actually things that are a little bit more universal in a way. So this diagram is about world superpowers and how these powerful figures and organizations are interconnected, and how they influence the world. So, politicians and bankers and billionaires and, tech giants, all of these people, and how they're connected to each other and how they influence each other and then the rest of the world. Look, Mark Lombardi likes to use these kind of very delicate, almost sort of, very not very sort of bombastic or forceful methods to indicate these actually quite, in some ways, dark and serious aspects of how the world operates through these connection points. These two maps are essentially doing the same thing, but as you can see, they're quite different. Visually, they're quite different, and ideologically, I would say they're really different too. The map on the right might be the one that you are all familiar with, the MTA map. If you go to any subway station, ask for a map. This is probably the map that you'll actually receive, the printed version of this thing. The map on the left was designed by a designer called Massimo Vignelli. He has passed away, but he was actually a very important designer for New York. Even though he's not from New York. His practice was very much based in New York, and he did a lot of work in and around New York, very important work. And one of the things that he did was he really tried to update the MTA transit map, and he did the signage system with his colleagues. He did the signage system for the New York subway system as well. And then the reason that he was championing this system that you see on the left was because he felt that this was a much more rational way to navigate an underground network. So the biggest difference between the two maps, besides the color combination, is that the map on the left is only concerned with adjacencies and connection points. So what that means is that it's less concerned with geographic accuracy. So exactly how far you are from, 23rd Street going to Union Square, like that's less of a concern with this map. The concern is that it takes 2 stops or 3 stops and you change at X station. Like that's the point of this map, because once you're underground, who cares really where you are, as long as you know how you're going from point A to point B, where you have to switch lines, this sort of thing. Whereas the map on the right is actually, it tries to be a little bit more faithful to geography, physical geography. It's still distorted. You can tell because the map of the shape of Manhattan is much more squat. We all know that Manhattan is actually much more sort of vertical. It's more elongated. The shape of Central Park is not like this. It's not squat like that. It's like much longer. And other details indicate that this was kind of slightly abbreviated, but still, I think New Yorkers, subway users found this map to be much more approachable because Manhattan and Brooklyn and these boroughs looked more familiar to them. It looked more familiar to other maps that they'd seen before. So it wasn't a giant leap to go from a map that they had looked at previously to this kind of map. Whereas the Vignelli version of the map on the left, the jump is quite large. And some of that is because the body of water is not indicated blue, the park is not indicated green. These are things that people just expect at some point because we're used to it. We're used to maps being drawn a certain way. So when a map doesn't behave this way, the immediate reaction was rejection, because people felt that there was just too much to learn and it wasn't behaving in the way that they wanted it to. I think the MTA is actually making a concerted effort to actually bring back some of the Vignelli version of maps and sort of signage systems. So we'll see where we land after the pandemic is over. So here you see 3 front pages of the Guardian newspaper. Obviously, these are not diagrams, but I think they diagram something. The first example is from the early 90s. The second example is from about 2000, kind of early to mid 2000s. The third example is contemporary, so very recent. So it shows a kind of evolution of a newspaper. So the Guardian and how they have changed not only its format, but its masthead. So the way the Guardian is written has changed. As you can see, each version has its own masthead, its own typography. The grid has changed, and the general sensibility of the front page has changed as well. So the oldest one on the left, the 8-column grid, the very tight 8-column grid, the black horizontal lines that indicate a new section or new story, the sans serif, bold sans serif typography, Helvetica, the Helvetica that's used in the masthead, all of these things sort of added up to the visual identity of the Guardian. And most notably, it was a broadsheet paper, which means that it was printed at a certain size. It was big. It was slightly kind of cumbersome, slightly unwieldy, and the paper decided that at a certain point that it didn't match the kind of the lifestyle of the modern lifestyle of people that are not reading their newspaper at their breakfast table in this kind of leisurely way. They're kind of on the move. You're trying to read the paper like while you're on the subway, on the tube. So there was a decision to make everything a bit smaller. So assume this tabloid version, so it's much narrower, smaller, so taking up less space. And then more colors is introduced, and then the masthead going to all lowercase, the columns, because the size of the paper shrank, which they went from 8 columns to 5 columns. And then the most recent update, I don't know, something about this that sort of reminds me more of something like a website, like a web page. The content to sort of branding area ratio has changed. There's more color. There's different colors that indicate different section of the paper. In some ways, it's become a little bit more magazine-y. So I think looking at the 3 different front pages of the same newspaper, it sort of indicates something. It indicates the need of the of contemporary readers, and how the paper had to sort of shift its shape to accommodate that, to sort of accommodate the contemporary reader's needs. Here are 3 different front pages from the New York Times. These are not so much about evolution over time, because actually the New York Times has changed relatively quite little over time. The masthead has been more or less the same. It does get tweaked in this kind of incremental ways, where it gets, the kinks get smoothed out, the typeface becomes a little bit more legible, a little bit more robust and digital friendly, and so on. But largely, the format hasn't changed. The general typographic sensibility hasn't changed. What's noting here, though, is how the usage of the front page changes based on different sort of incidents over time. So the first one shows the front page of the Times on 9/12, so September 12th, the day after 9/11. As you can see, when something huge happens, more real estate is dedicated to images. So in this case, you see the Twin Towers exploding, and that image is printed very, very large on the front page for obvious reasons. And the entire front page of the Times that day is just about this one very tragic event. And then the front page in the middle and at the end on the far right, these are quite recent. You may have seen these in person recently. But the middle one shows the US unemployment rate, which has been the worst since the Great Depression. And by using the graph in this way, and by utilizing real estate in this way, so you can see how the gray of the chart in the sort of top part of the newspaper, gray goes above, and then the red falls below average. And then if you see how far the red dips below, not only below average, but further than it's ever gone, just relative relatively to the scale that you see before this one column, the far right column, you understand the seriousness of the situation. You understand how extraordinary the situation is. If you look at the image on the right, the Times has made this choice, this actually quite a bold choice, to not use any real estate for any other stories except for this, which is not really a story, it's a list of losses due to coronavirus. I mean, this was a very poignant use of the front page, and very, I mean, it was actually quite difficult to look at this cover page, because it was such a tragic sort of kind of visualization of what was happening in the US at the time, and is still happening. So, and this is only a fraction of the incalculable losses that are sort of taking up the front page. So, well, I want to show you a few different examples of books that do sort of take similar tacks as narrative objects. And when you think about the portfolio, a portfolio is a kind of book, and the book should be a narrative project. And to understand that, let's think about what narrative means. So, if you look up the definition of the word narrative in a dictionary, you see several definitions, but you might be concerned with, or you might be familiar with, this first definition is the kind of immediate definition that we think about, which is the practice or art of telling stories. But what I'm really interested in is the second definition, which is a representation of a particular situation or process in such a way as to reflect or conform to an overarching set of aims or values. So if you think about that definition for a minute, it means that everything you do to make the bigger thing, so choices that you make, elements that you use to build the bigger thing, those need to conform to an overarching set of aims or values, or an overarching concept. So today I talked to you about images and diagrams. And if you think about images and diagrams as these kind of constituent parts, these elements that build something bigger. So in this case, build a book, if you start with a smaller scale, it builds a page, and then those pages build a chapter, and the chapter builds the book. That whole thing is a narrative. So to think about the smaller parts and how they add up to a comprehensive narrative is actually a very important way to think about visual representation. I want to show you this one example, actually, maybe through a video. I think it's a really nice example of this idea of the visual narrative and how the visual narrative can be thought of.
Contamination. After the Fukushima nuclear disaster, more than 25,000 hectares of farmland were affected by radiation. A team of environmental scientists has developed an innovative decontamination method that allows Fukushima farmers to grow perfectly safe rice again. The data proves that the rice is safe, but people don't buy it because they don't understand scientific data. To help them understand, we created a book made out of rice straw grown on the decontaminated fields in Fukushima. Following traditional methods, the rice straw was crafted into paper. The book tells the story of Fukushima, the region, the disaster, and the decontamination. The farmers and their products. Using a wide range of sources to let readers form their own view. 296 pages with photography, interviews, and background information. But most of all, data turned into understanding manifested in paper. Made in Fukushima, a book to help people understand with their eyes and hands.
As you saw, the book was an attempt to sort of educate people outside of the region of how decontamination happened in Fukushima, and and the fact that it's actually safe to consume products from this region. Um, and I think what was really impressive about this project was that all of these elements were very intentional in the way that they were sort of created, curated, produced, and put together. So if you look at this slide, you see there's kind of two large narratives here. One is the kind of human story, and that's told through photography and quotes from farmers and scientists and vendors and makers from this region. And then another parallel narrative is the data, as they say. So, because it is ultimately about presenting this data and allowing other people from other regions to decision makers from other regions to understand exactly what happened here. So that's done through data visualization, presenting facts in this very understandable, digestible way. So these two things run in parallel in the book, and then the production of the book itself actually is packaged in this really sort of thoughtful way. They used rice hay that was harvested from this region and then turned into sort of handmade paper by paper makers of this region. And then the book was printed on that paper and then disseminated. And I think it's just like a really successful project in that way, because there was a goal, and that goal was sort of met by this kind of very thoughtful process of collecting, curating, producing, and disseminating. This book is a book for Tadao that shows Tadao Ando's work, and if you know his work, I think this cover will make a lot of sense. So he's quite well known for these exposed concrete walls, concrete finish, and the paper in a way. Usually, concrete is used as a kind of kind of the structural element, and then you put some kind of like cladding or some sort of surface material on top of it. And in a similar way, like when you make a book, you use, when you're making a hardcover book, you use grey board. And grey board is usually this kind of structural element that gets wrapped with either book cloth or printed paper and sometimes laminated. So it's this material that usually doesn't get seen. It provides the strength, the structural element, but it's not something that's necessarily seen all the time. So in that way, I think there's a nice sort of parallel between how Tadao Ando thinks about material in his buildings and how this book is produced. Inside the book, though, is actually, it's a little bit hard to tell with these photographs, but I think that sensibility doesn't trickle down into the pages. These seem fairly sort of standard fare, layout where you have full spread images, full spread text, like big quote pages, image paired with, a single column text. So this is quite, I would say that the way that the book is laid out is quite conventional, even though I think all the idea is actually in the cover in this case. I wanted to actually make a comparison between two contemporary studios. One is called 6A, they're based in London, and the other one is Big Bjerke Engels Group, which they're based in Denmark, but also in New York and other places. And that they're both sort of successful in their own right, but very, very different studios. And I want to talk about how their practice as architecture studios is expressed through graphic design and how those things actually align quite well. So with 6A architects, a lot of their work is in the kind of cultural realm. It seems they do some retail spaces, but a lot of their projects are sort of more, they're not huge sort of, these kind of, they don't make stadiums, they don't make big, complexes or do like master plans or big, skyscrapers. The projects seem to be a little bit more modest in scale and very, very thoughtful in the way that they design and sort of think about materials, and also think about how they communicate their ideas. So if you look at their website, it's actually, I think this sensibility is becomes quite palpable. So the way that they photograph their space is also quite neutral, not super glamorous. The lighting is very natural. If you look at this one image, the bottom left corner, these images are actually used quite small, almost as sort of illustrations for the text. So that's one way of communicating a kind of ethos, your kind of relationship to design. Even this image, this drawing on the top right corner is this very delicate line drawing. It's very sort of light-handed, and I think that's a sensibility of their sort of image oeuvre. And that's paired with typographic choices as well. The typography and the website design and the book design that I'll show you was done by John Morgan Studio. And they, the typography feels very sort of, in some ways, very straight, and it is very straight. But all the care is in the details, the way that they use small caps and spacing and alignments and white space. All of these things. That's the design. The design isn't just about adding more things. The design is paring down, being very intentional, selection of a very particular typeface, use of a particular type size. These subtle choices, I think, indicate their the studio's sort of taste and the kind of view on what design sensibility is. This is one book they produce. It's called Never Modern. And as you can see, if you look at the spreads here, there's a few things that you can, even without looking at the actual object, there are a few things that you can kind of glean. One is that this is probably quite a small book. So it's not this big, glossy sort of coffee table book. It's a small book. You hold it in your hand. It probably feels like a paperback or something like that. The cover is very modest. There's no imagery. There's nothing fancy on the cover. It's just typographic. A very thoughtful typography, but just typography. Very succinct title. And then inside, it's interesting to see the relationship between the images and the text. So the text is, I would argue that the text is probably, the dominant element here, and the image sort of illustrates the text, or kind of qualifies the text in some ways. And these two spreads, they don't even show images of their design spaces. The book is really about the designer talks about kind of bricolage as a kind of methodology, meaning collection of disparate things to create something else. So they talk about that, and the book is really about that methodology and their relationship to other cultural sort of references. So it's not even the way that they sort of talk about them as a design studio, as a practice, is really through other references, and spoken to you in this kind of sort of conversational but also serious and quite sober way, without being sort of bombastic or sort of being hitting you over the head with it. This Studio Big, their website, I think is very recognizable, because I can't really think of another studio that does this sort of thing, where you use lots of icons on the front page. I mean, I think this used to be a thing in the past, but it remains, for me, it feels like a very sort of important part of their identity at this point, because they've had this website for a long time, and they continue to use this way of indicating the breadth of their work. I think when you land on this homepage with all these different icons, the first thing I think this studio is trying to communicate is, look at all these different projects we've done. It's the breadth of the work. The depth is not important now. Right now, when you land on the page, what you should be impressed with is the number of projects they've done since the inception of the studio. So you get that. And then when you click on one of these icons, you see an image. And think about this type of image next to the images that we saw from the 6A studio. Very, very different kind of image. So Big is, not concerned with the fact that these are kind of synthetic, like renderings. It doesn't, like the image that is representing the project not being an actual image is unimportant. In fact, maybe it's better because it shows the ambition, it shows scale, it shows a kind of aspirational attitude, which seems to be important for this studio. So yeah, I mean the scale of these things are very different. The scale of the photography is very different. The color of the photography is very saturated. And it's very kind of sort of impressive, and the typography even here, it's quite hard to see at this scale, but is very mannered. So they use this kind of pixel font as a way of indicating sort of an identity for their studio, which is the complete opposite of what 6A was doing with this very organic, classical, reading focused serif typography. So similarly with this one publication that came out of the studio, this was an older publication called Yes is More. I mean, even the title itself, a play off of Less is More, indicates a certain kind of directness and a kind of, it's very sort of accessible in a way. You sort of kind of get what they're trying to do. And it borrows the form, the kind of visual rhetoric of a cartoon, of a comic book. And a comic book is something that we all understand. We know what they look like. Even if you're not a fan, you sort of get the grammar of the comic book. And so Bjarke Ingels is tapping into that and utilizing that structure and the paradigm of the comic book to talk about his buildings and his ideas. And if he is somebody that's really interested in sort of simplifying and making these complex ideas very understandable and accessible to everyone, not only an architectural viewer, but for everyone, then the comic book seems like a very apt sort of format for it. So Ken is going to give you the second half of part one lecture tomorrow, and it'll be based around typography, leading into a very brief InDesign demo, and then he will also talk you through some book examples as these kind of narrative objects.